Welcome to the Dreamboat. This is where we explore everything to do with dreams.
We are sponsored by the DRI Centre for Dream Studies, and you can find out more about our work in the show notes.
You can join us here every fortnight or at one of our dream courses, workshops, or retreats. Thank you for coming on board.
My guest today is Linda Mastrangelo. Linda has been a leading light in the world of dreams, and many of you will probably know her or know of her. She's coming today to talk about grief, loss, dream psychopomps, more on that later, and possibly ancestral dreams. She's Executive Director of the Institute for Dream Studies in the US, Professor of Consciousness and Transformative Studies at John F. Kennedy University, and a Board Director of the International Association for the Study of Dreams. She's a psychotherapist in private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area and a writer of some exciting work on dreams. Linda, it is absolutely lovely to have you on board. What an amazing pedigree. I love it.
Oh, Laura, thank you so much for having me on your show.
It's a treat. I've been wanting to have you on board for a long, long time, and our paths have never fully crossed, but it's really great to have you here. Thank you for joining us. And what an interesting subject. I have always been very fascinated by the notion of psychopomps, and I know for a lot of people they'll be thinking, what is a psychopomp? So I'm going to say over to you, Linda. Explain what you mean and why they're important and how they surface in dreams.
Oh, I would love to. And it might help to recognize that the psychopompic world is primarily around what we would call like the underworld, or working with ancestral dreaming and wisdom and people who have passed. There's also, I can get into more of what I was telling you earlier. It's such a vast state of consciousness, but we can primarily talk about that kind of connecting with people who have passed. It can also be about being a messenger or supporting people who are either needing to pass. And this, of course, depends on your belief systems, of course. But this idea of supporting those who have recently transitioned and might need help.
And by that, you mean people who've died. Yeah.
People who have died. Correct. Yeah. And working with trauma and certainly with families as well, because that's also very important. So yeah, it's very deep work. It's more of a calling, I would say.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
By psychopomps, regular listeners know that I'm really interested in the Asclepian methods of dreaming, the ancient Greek sort of rites for dreaming. And for the ancient Greeks, one of the key psychopomps that would turn up in a dream was the dog. If you dreamt of a dog, very often the dog was the one that was bringing you the messages from those that had passed and were now, for the Greeks, living in the underworld. And so it was a messenger that went between what I would call two planes of existence.
Well, it's perfect, Laura. Absolutely. That's the Cerebus, right? We're talking about it could be creatures. Often it could also be gods and goddesses, like a Hermes or a Kuan Yin. There's extraordinary, I love what you were talking about, the Asclepian temples. Absolutely. But this is like a collective universal figure, and you will see it all over the world in indigenous cultures as well. The owl, the bat, the raven, usually night creatures, of course, Cerebus, right? The dog. So absolutely. So a lot of this stems from a very ancient origin of those who are messengers, or what we would call the guide of souls. Like the psychopomp is the guide of souls and supporting those who have recently died. So it does carry with it a lot of these ancient origins. And certainly the ancient Greeks were tapped into that, and even working with the temples, as you're talking about, and the ancestors. And of course, dream incubation was a huge part of that a ritual. And so yes, dreams of this kind, including dreams of underworld psychopompic figures like that, absolutely play into this experience and this consciousness.
What drew you? I know you're a psychotherapist in practice, but you also work distinctly with grief, loss, around death. What drew you personally to that type of work? Because it's a very special calling, isn't it?
Yes, and it's so interesting. I started to really sit with that question, Laura, because I wasn't consciously aware. Like if you had shared with me in the past that I would be working with hospice and working with grief and loss and actually doing this work, I would have been very shocked. I wouldn't have understood that. And at the same time, it's so clear. And so I can give you an example of this. One of my very first memories, and I call it a memory because it's so strong. And it was me as a child, like very young. I must have been about 2 or 3 years old. I remember being in the catacombs and working and sitting with the bones and being very comfortable in this space. I literally remember myself like holding the bones in my hands, and I know it sounds very morbid and intense, but in my recall of it was so natural, and I was very comfortable in that environment. And I remember asking my father about it, because I have ancestors in Italy. There, and in those spaces that we do have, it's very underworldy, in southern Italy, in fact. And he was kind of looking at me like I was nuts, and he was like, "What are you talking about?" So it makes me wonder about, is that a memory I had? Could it be an ancient memory? Which to me was such a preface and a calling, as you know, it is, to this work, right? It started from my very first memory. And certainly my dream life was extraordinarily active when I was young, and it was very intense. I would absolutely say I felt like I had one foot in one world and one foot in this world. I was very much in the in between and very comfortable in that in between place. But it was also very intense and very scary. I didn't have a lot of support or understanding of what was going on with me. It was very intense. And, I often think back about, wow, here I felt kind of thrown into this intense, energetic field of, even picking up on the land and the dead on that land that I was living in, not really understanding what was going on, but the intensity of it and um the not having that context for what this was, it was very unsettling, but it was certainly telling about my connection to that field, to the ancestors, to the land, and to the memory of of those places. So it started immediately, like coming into the world. I was already in the other world, or straddling both places.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so you obviously took that through with you. Did you start life as a psychotherapist, or did you, venture into other fields first, like a lot of us have done?
Yeah, I mean, for me, dreams came later. Working in this way came much later. I think because I was scared of that side of myself. So I would often say there was a split that happened where this hidden part of myself was these experiences, the dreams, the connecting in this way. And so I felt like I had to put on this kind of persona of, trying to navigate the waking world. And so it took me a while to find what I call my community of people who were dreamers, who understood my experiences, who connected with me in this way. So it took, I would say, up until my 30s, where I did have a profound dream letting me know I was going to find my people. I was going to find my community and do this work. But it took me a while to get there. But it was always there. I wrote my dreams down. I knew this was important, but it was hidden. It was like I totally split that part of myself.
I did wonder whether you had yourself a profound loss or death that had inspired you in this way, or whether it was just a general calling that you found that was the area that you wanted to work with.
I think it was more about finding the courage to put myself out in the world in this way because I had hidden it so long. And that there was some deep shame or deep, like, that it wasn't okay. Like there was something wrong or not okay. So I believe for me it was finally finding that community, that holding to help me be brave and courageous in my full authentic self, that I can, this wasn't something I needed to hide anymore, that I could literally come out, as, an onaeronaut, as a dream traveler, as a worker in this way that is, that I felt was so taboo or not okay, or, I might even be seen as crazy or, it was so strong in me.
Well,
So
it's some no small subject, death, is it? And it's interesting for all of us. Dreams in particular. It's often where loved ones who've passed do come back and share our dreams, and as if they'd never gone. I had a recent dream of my parents, both who passed. Almost 20 years ago now, and my father even longer. And yet there they were in the dream, having a chat, doing the things that they would have done. And, you wake up and it feels like normal. And then you think, hang on a minute, they've been dead. This is, and it's the absurdity of when you wake, but the beauty of the connection when you're asleep and they come back. Is that what a lot of people report, do you find?
yes, and I love, first of all, oh, how wonderful. Thank you for sharing your experience with your folks. That's beautiful, Laura. I think that's one of the biggest blessings of the work that I do. I get to hear and sit with and walk beside people who have had these tremendous losses, and yet they can come to me and feel safe sharing these kinds of experiences that they had in their visits. And I think that's what makes the visitation dream its own very special experience. And I often like to share that because there is a difference between like grief dreams and visitation dreams. Because grief dreams are often a reflection of what that means, the grief. Could be unfinished business. It could be a trauma that my clients have experienced. Because as we know, watching your loved one, especially whether it's a sudden loss or over time illness, is an extraordinarily painful and shocking experience, even when we know it's coming. It's profound. And I like to call it initiatory in many ways because there's a shattering that happens when we experience that kind of grief, that loss. So, what I found is that there are dreams that reflect that profoundly.
Are there any particular symbols that come up? How, when it's a grief type of dream, are there any particular sort of regular symbols that you've seen?
So I can give you an example. So one of the things that, especially if someone you love has an illness, and some of us may experience that transition, which can be, horrific, of course, because we don't want to see our loved ones suffer, and then the changes that happen when we transition can also be very traumatic for people, especially if we, certainly our loved ones, when we see so vibrant, and then when we start to see them transition, it's shocking. It can be very shocking, especially if we are not prepared for that. And so a lot of times I'll have clients share with me dreams that reflect that trauma towards the end of life and that transformational experience, whether it be when their loved ones stop eating, or they have what's called that breathing. It's not a kind
Death
of the
rattle.
death
Yeah,
rattle. Yes, what
yeah.
I'm talking
Mm.
about. So there may be dreams that reflect that experience, whether it be, I had one client share, they had a dream where their loved one was like, had a bag over their head and couldn't breathe, right? So it really was more about the experience of watching that happen and unfold for them. Obviously that was extraordinarily traumatic, even though it's a natural occurrence when we pass and when we transition to happen. But for someone to witness that is very different.
Particularly the
So
first time you hear it or see that, it's as if the person you love is suffocating. It's horrific.
exactly. And that's exactly what the dream presented, was a suffocation. And so that helped us as an entry point explore the trauma part of what happened. And we could go into that dream gently as a map, I call it. It's a map for the grief. It lets us know where are the areas that are coming in where the person needs support. And so it was such a powerful way for me to know and for us to work together using that, working with that dream.
I like the idea of the map. I think that's lovely. And when you're working with someone's grief map, what do you include? What do you obviously include the dream material, but how do you work with that map?
I'm really appreciating the training and work I did at hospice around this, because I got to work with Alan Wolfelt's model. It's the morning tasks, which I felt really helped bring the map of grief to light, in the sense of all the different ways in which we try to integrate the loss. And I know there's crossover with Kubler-Ross's work as well, who is an incredible pioneer in this field around grief. So there is this, it's a nonlinear map, which I think is important because, grief isn't linear, but it gives you kind of a way to notice if there are things that may come up, in the grieving process. Often is making, sense of the death. The reality of the death is a big one, for example. And dreams might reflect that. Like, we can't believe it's true, right? So working with integrating that is part of that, remembering them. Alan Wolfelt talks a lot about the being in the wilderness of our grief, meaning that we are lost. We don't have a map, right? There's a shattering that happens, and we're trying to literally put ourselves back together in many ways because we don't know. Another task is identity. Like, who am I now?
Yeah.
you know? So to give you an idea of ways in which we can work with those tasks, as well as how they are reflected in the dreams that we have of those losses. Yeah. So I found that to be such powerful work. And as you work, you can distinguish between those kinds of dreams, which do reflect more of that, the grieving process, versus an actual visitation dream, which has a very different quality to it.
I really like the separation of the two states, and I think that's really powerful. And you're right, grief and loss understandably come in many different stages. As you mentioned, there's the Kubler-Ross model. I think she was the first one that defined the 5 stages of grief, wasn't she? About anger and disbelief. It's the disbelief part, I think, that confuses a lot of people because on one hand, they know someone's died. And yet on the other hand, it's yeah, but I don't believe they've died, particularly if it's someone who's not old, who's a lot younger or a contemporary. That, for a lot of people, is very hard to assimilate. And I'm intrigued how disbelief surfaces in dreams. I find it quite interesting, and I can see how that can merge slightly into visitation dreams. I'm just thinking again of a personal loss recently of a very close friend, and I went back to her house actually this week, and I hadn't been for since she died, since well before she died, and I stood there and I had this massive sense of utter disbelief that it had happened, as if there's part of me that's still trying to catch up with something that I intrinsically know has happened. And it's like, as you say, it's this splitting, this separation. But she has often come in dreams, and it's been lovely and it's warm. And that then has been obviously clearly a visitation dream rather than a grief dream, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Oh, and Laura, I'm so, so sorry about that. And understandably, because it is a shock to the system, right? Like, and in that process of integration, I want to bring so much gentleness and compassion to that, the disbelief. Because, and like you said, when it's sudden too, there's an impact that happens, for sure. And to answer your question, yeah, how to tease out the visitation versus having a disbelief dream, I would say often in the dreams that I've received from people have shared, like, their loved one is in the dream, but they're not, maybe they're ignoring them, you know, like, as, or they're just going about their day in the dream, and the dreamer's trying to get their attention. There's
Yeah.
there's a lot of different expressions of that, but and then they get angry in the dream, like, why aren't you here? Why aren't you paying attention to me? And that's the power of dreams, right? It's really about the emotions. And so if I'm feeling angry in the dream that my loved one is, like, just, ignoring or going about their day and not paying attention, we're really gonna hone in on that, like, that feeling of maybe there's some anger. Why did you leave?
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
aren't
Yeah.
you here? How can you leave me behind? And when we sit with that, we're like, oh, right? There's so much that comes with that, the anger, which can be taboo for people. People don't wanna, I think anger is one of the most complex feelings we can have around grief. It can feel very uncomfortable or taboo.
There's a lot of guilt as well, isn't there? And I think that's the problem. You feel guilty that you feel angry. And yet Kubler-Ross quite rightly says, where's that anger going to go? Because that's the bit when someone's died that often destroys a family, because the anger is so overwhelming, and all the little, shifts and fault lines within the family setup are brutally exposed sometimes because of the anger.
Oh my goodness, absolutely. And like you said, especially if that person was like the glue or the centerpiece or they, this is also one of the things that, as a grief therapist, working with families who are are completely untethered because their person, this person who might have been like the glue or the one that kept everyone in harmony and together, is suddenly, gone. And now what? Right. And so, yes, so the dreams are absolutely, they're beautiful entry points, and they can also bring in more of those complex emotions and the anger and feeling, why did you leave, left behind? And this is also really prevalent in what we would call disenfranchised grief. This is grief that maybe someone suicided, or like you said, there was a sudden loss and there wasn't time to say the things, or the guilt, like you're talking about, the tremendous guilt people may have felt. I could have done something, or, I call it the woulda, coulda, shouldas, right? The things that we regret can
The whole
also be
conditional tense stuff, the magic wand stuff.
right, as if, right? There's such a that I feel like is one of the more painful, challenging aspects of grief. The woulda, coulda, shouldas, the guilt or the unfinished business is also a big one, which, interestingly, I feel the visitation dreams can often bring that peace and healing to those like agonizing, painful experiences that people have when they do get those visits, and it's often like, it doesn't even have to be, it's interesting. Visitation dreams can come in so many different forms. And I really want to emphasize that, because sometimes people get upset. They're like, why haven't I had this dream? And so I want to also preface that by saying, it's not always going to be the way we imagine them to be either. So that's so important. But certainly, like what you were sharing with your parents coming through, there can be this like, wow, like where it is a visit. You really feel it. There's a numinous quality to the dream. It has people feel like they're in the room. Either they're in the room with me, or you're meeting them somewhere in a place. But there is such a potent, numinous, intense quality to these visits. They're very distinct. That's why I like to distinguish the grief dreams with the visitations, because sometimes people can get very upset when they have a grief dream and then they think it's a visit. Like, why are they ignoring me? And I'm like, well, is it because that's something more in your heart that you're grieving? There's something there, versus like when they have a visit, it's very different. It's a very potent, yeah. And it could be a message. It could be, I'm okay. It could be just an embrace. It can actually be a message, like a specific message, or just, I'm here. It's just profound, just how personal that is as well.
The Dreamboat is a project of the DRI Center for Dream Studies. If you're the kind of person who is fascinated by the mystery of dreams and you want to learn more about the transformational power of dream work, check out our workshops, lectures, retreats, and training courses at driccpe.org.uk. Also on the website, you can support the podcast and all of DRI's work by becoming a member for just over £30 a year. That gets you discounts and first access for our ticketed events, as well as access to videos and extra material online. That's driccpe.org.uk, and you can find the link in the show notes. Now back to the podcast.
How do psychopomps fit in with that? Would you call a visitation dream, would the person who's passed, would they be the psychopomp at that moment, or is that something separate for you?
Yeah, great question. So it's different in the way. So I'll give you an example. Like, and this was a very painful time. This was years ago. I had a dear friend who suicided, and it just rocked our community and certainly rocked we had a very tight knit circle of us together. And so his partner and our best friend, we were all just devastated over this loss. And so one night I had a very lucid dream experience with this friend who wanted me to know that it was a visit, certainly. He was like, I'm okay. He was wearing his favorite shirt. He was in a space that he loved. And that's not unusual, by the way, when we have visitations where we might see our loved one in their like favorite outfit, maybe a favorite time period, an age that they loved. They could be like, oh, they were in their prime, right? Whatever age that was. And you'll often see that, doing things that they loved. It's pretty neat. So I just wanted to add that piece to it. So, but he wanted me to bring messages to his wife and my friend, because he couldn't, and he couldn't reach them. So it was interesting that was a one of those profound moments where I was like, oh, okay. Sometimes we may have those experiences where we may need to bring those messages, and that can be very delicate. And I know that's a whole different conversation around, when we have those experiences, or when the deceased want to bring messages, want to connect.
Yeah.
And then I've had dreams where I'm actually doing some healing work with those who have passed. I can give you an example of that. There was once, I guess you can call a spirit, who I could feel this intense pain that they had. And their physicality expressed that as well. They were almost like corpse-like in the way in which they showed themselves. And I'll never forget, normally that would have been a very like intense experience to see like a corpse-like figure engaging. And so in that space, I was able to bring my heart, light, and intention to heal. And so in that moment, I started to see the corpse turn into this whole person. It was a man. I didn't know what he looked like or what he was in the beginning, but then I saw that it was this young man, and so who had a lot of pain, anger, tragic death. And sometimes that happens where I will have experiences where I'm healing those who are stuck or feeling that stuck in their pain and grief, and I help them heal or transition or feel like, move through their trauma.
Do you feel that their spirit on the other side is looking for you, finds you in some way because it knows that you've got this type of connection and can offer this kind of healing? Is that your take on it?
Absolutely. And I feel that way with my friend. And, I think that happens to those who may be more in that work or their calling, that they may have those kinds of experiences where they're going to connect in that way. And that's certainly been my experience over the years. And I often joke, I say, I feel like I have two jobs. Like I'm working during the day with my clients and with their grief and loss. And then at night, I will have these other experiences.
It's
And
another form of visitation, isn't it? But from somebody who's not of your own from your own clan, for want of a better description.
and who knows, that's, I think, is
Perhaps
interesting.
they will. Yeah.
But I don't, in this waking life, know who they are, but absolutely, yeah. And I'll get little glimpses of their situation and why they're stuck or what's going on. And so I'll be in there as a support system and helping, and even feeling the familiar, like the family and their pain, and trying to coordinate and support, but in this other kind of field and realm, if that makes sense. So it's more around being that role for those, just as I do here in waking life with my clients. Um, so it's yeah. So there is a distinction there around that,
Yeah.
because we all
It's a
have.
different form of channeling, isn't it, for want of a better description?
Yes,
It's
yes.
you're to channel in dreams and offer healing to those who've passed and what I would call are stuck in some way. How beautiful, and what an interesting use of dreams, actually.
Oh. And it shows exactly what you just said there, I think is important. The expansiveness of this field and the way in which, like, that's what I mean by, like, there's not just that, right? We can talk even more about those different experiences. Like, I've worked with ancestors, or I've worked with healers and medicine people in the dream time, giving me, trainings, or I'm assisting them with those who have passed, and they need support. And so it's even working with others who are doing this work as well.
Just
And
briefly,
yeah.
what do you think is happening in these moments? Is it that I mean, I often call consciousness just it's a constant turning of the dial. So, I mean, in many ways, a lot of people, as you say, a lot of medicine people do this type of work awake, not asleep. And so, I mean, I often see it as like a little turn of the dial of consciousness. Yeah, we're entering a bigger stream, and for most of us, it normally only happens when we go to sleep and when we enter the dream space. How do you see it? Is it something along those lines as well?
Well, I do see that it's a spectrum, in the sense that, because I've experienced things that, like, I like that turn of a dial thing, because I do believe there's some sense of, like, where, consciousness, in and of itself. There's, this idea of vibration and frequency and how we resonate. And so it's interesting when we can imagine, and that in imagination, right? In the way in which we are open to these experiences. And that's why I like to say that it's really more about our own willingness to be open and expansive and curious. And when we can open ourselves up in this way, we're missing so much, right? Thinking about how much we filter out. And I know we need to
Exactly.
survive, right? We need to, like, live in this world, but it also can prevent us from actually experiencing the world more fully than we are. That there's so much going on, in these different fields. And dreams, I feel like everyone dreams. So that's an amazing way for us to access these kinds of consciousness experiences, right? But certainly we can do that through meditation, through drumming, through just opening our hearts, dance, sound. There's so many ways we can access these different states of consciousness and what's there. So it's wonderful when we can open ourselves up to these possibilities. And I do feel one of the things that I'm passionate about is that I do believe there are some sacred places like the Asclepian temples that are more hotspots, if that makes sense, like
Yeah.
that
Yes.
can induce more of those experiences that lend to that. Like I do feel there is, I imagine you being so sensitive, Laura. I'm sure you've had experiences in certain places where you've had, like,
Yeah,
whoa, this
yeah,
is
exactly. I mean, I find that sort of, when you're in, I think use the word hotspot. I love that, where you go to certain places and you think, okay, this feels pokey, as I call it.
yeah,
Okay, we could
there
do
you
some
go.
interesting work here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's times when I go back to Canada and I go onto First Nation land, beautiful. I mean, that really, that's and places like that I've been to in the States, as well as here in the UK, where I'm speaking from today. You go to, say, something like Stonehenge in the UK, or places where there are standing stones. Even people who don't consider themselves sensitive notice something is different. They can feel this change of resonance, for want of a better description, in their body.
And that's not an accident, right? I mean, they're in these spaces for very good reason,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, there's a lot of work done on ley lines and things like that. And I think that is powerful and points to some of these places. But there's something else that happens there, something deeper than just it being marked out by a ley line and specific types of energy. I think the energy's always been there. Perhaps, ancient cultures have found them and recognized something and hence built a temple. But I find it interesting that obviously in the UK, as an example, a lot of churches around old Roman sites have built the church where the Romans themselves had their temples, as if there was an unconscious remembering or recognizing that this is a special place. So this temple, this church needs to go here. And I agree with you. If we're going to bring this back to sort of dreaming gives us an ability for all of us to tune into something that we might consider that we're not sensitive enough to feel in our waking lives, is how I see it.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to the ancestral knowledge, right? And what you said, I thought was really amazing. Yeah, the knowing. We all have this inner knowing and that lineage, that ancestral knowing, which is tied to the land. Absolutely. And I definitely want to invite those who are interested in doing that kind of work. Like your dreams are an amazing bridge for that kind of knowledge, that knowing. Happy to give examples of this, but I will say that I have learned so much about my not only my ancestors, but my ancient ancestors through dream incubation and practicing, intention, asking for knowledge or asking for specific things before you go to bed, to bring in those questions or the inquiries or the connections that you want. I'll give you an example. So I have a lot of dreams of snake and egg. I have my little snake here, but
Oh,
I learned later about the Orphic symbol of
yes,
the
the snake.
snake with wrapped around the egg. But it was something that was so profoundly, like, it was just kept showing up. And later I learned that so I have family who live in the Apulia region, the what we would call the heel of Italy, and in this very small town that actually later I didn't realize was an archaeological site of the Orphics. so
Wow.
and so I connect. I was like, oh, here we go. Learning that we may have these messages coming through in our dreams that initially like, why is the symbol showing up? And it would show up in very different ways. Even myself being the egg and the snake wrapping around my body, And then another dream, I actually incubated. I wanted to know more about my ancient ancestors. I said, before I went to bed. And the dream itself was very odd. I was in a laboratory, and all of a sudden I could feel the shift in the air, and these 5 snakes came into the room, all one on top of the other, kind of like in unison. And I remember feeling extraordinarily startled about this. And the snakes came up and towered over me. And I sat back on the floor, in astonishment. But they kept their attention on me. And it was very, and beyond intense. And so I wake up from this dream going, what does this have to do with my ancient ancestors, right? And so I'm really grateful that I draw my dreams. And I really recommend that for people.
Yeah, exactly.
Because when I drew the dream out, then I had the aha. Because then it became clear that this was an emblem. The way the snakes, the 5 were right on top of the other.
Oh, like interesting motif. Yeah, like a shield of some kind.
Well,
heraldic language. Yeah.
Look at this. So and this is where we appreciate the internet, right? I saw this was
Quick
an
Google.
I did. I said, okay, is there anything with 5 snakes on top of the other, right? And sure enough, this book shows up talking about the area of Carnac in France, where all like the Stonehenge, right? There's all these men here, like it's a huge site.
It is, yeah.
And they speak about this specific stone that has 5 snakes, like my emblem, my symbol, and it was an ancestral burial site.
Yeah, wow. Oh, how fascinating. So you've obviously have a connection with that, or you've been pulling down something from the collective unconscious, as Jung would say, that you've channeled in some way.
Yeah,
I love it.
And this is what I mean by staying open to messages, because they may come in so many different forms or in ways that we may not expect. And to stay with it, to be, because if I took this dream like, oh, and just dismissed it or, didn't really stay curious, I may have lost this whole side of it, the drawing of it. And even the lab was interesting because later I was able to get my DNA. Like I thought, oh, let me start, because I was doing a lot of ancestral work. And so I wonder if the lab part was also letting me know about how I'm going to discover more of this,
DNA
in my
stuff.
Yeah,
exactly.
Really neat. And I was able to validate that for sure.
Love it. I love it. I mean, just briefly, because I know we're running out of time. Just briefly, the snake dream, just to sort of round this, make an Ouroboros of our conversation. The snake dream, in that respect, would you see those as psychopomps in that context for you? That they were giving you a message from the other side?
Absolutely. And the snake itself is also very tied to this work, I believe, for sure.
And the Asclepian, it was a fundamental part of the Asclepian imagery. And they had the Asclepian snakes in the incubation temples. But again, as a psychopomp, was often how they were seen.
And exactly. And this is the other huge piece of what you're talking about in terms of calling and bringing in these very ancient practices, which go way back. And even so it's been really powerful to discover all these mystery schools in that area of Italy, the Pythagorean mystery schools, for example, Empedocles, the poets, those who actually practice this deep form of dream incubation. This is such an ancient practice, and it feels very aligned to that lineage of my own ancestry and doing this work, I'm part of this long line of dreamers, the ones who did this psychopompic work and did dream incubations and healing. Even my own recent ancestors, I didn't learn till later. My great aunt, my Zia Carmela, and my great grandmother Stelina were dreamers, and they would do lucid dream work and dream incubation and healing in the village that I'm talking about, the one where the Orphics were found. So it's a beautiful Ouroboros here, right?
Isn't it? Oh, Linda, I'm loving it. Linda, thank you so much. I mean, I'm glad that you're keeping this lineage going. It's been absolutely wonderful to hear some of your experiences and to learn about your work. Thank you for sharing your fascinating examples, and look forward to talking to you again. So many thanks. Yeah.
And thank you, Laura. And you're providing this sacred space for us to share this deep work. So I want to honor you for bringing that as such important work you're doing, bringing in the space, the sacred space for us to share in this way. So thank you for having me here.
So, thank you for joining us for this week's episode. Don't forget to like us and leave comments on your favourite podcast platform. As I'm sure you know, that's the way we build an audience for the Dreamboat podcast and also to spread news about dreaming. And as we said, there are many ways you can share your dreams at the DRI, the Dream Research Institute.
Yes, we have courses, events, and workshops, and we want to hear from you. So check out the show notes for links, or find us on Instagram and on our Facebook page and on our website at driccpe.org.uk. And if you want to explore your dreams further, or you would like to support us, you can join the DRI as a member for just £30 a year. As a member, you will get discounts for all of our events and short courses. You'll get our newsletter with latest dream research news, and we'll also be adding other special member benefits during the year. Of course, members' dreams will always be given preference for reading on the podcast Dream of the Week slot. So go to the link on the show notes and become a DRI member today. Keep dreaming and keep sharing your dreams.